Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. The drip, drip, drip from the kitchen ceiling had become the soundtrack to my week. It started small, a faint patter only noticeable in the dead of night, but it had grown into a persistent, unapologetic rhythm, a constant reminder of the chaos blooming just above the drywall. My husband, Mark, bless his heart, is a wonderful man in many ways, a brilliant architect, a steady provider, but when it comes to home repairs, let's just say his talents lie elsewhere. After his third attempt to just tighten a few things resulted in a shower of rusty water and a rather impressive new stain on the linoleum, each side, run a hand through his already disheveled hair, and said, "I'm calling David." David, Mark's college buddy. I'd met him a handful of times over the 20-odd years Mark and I had been married, usually at barbecues or the occasional New Year's Eve party. He was quieter than Mark, more reserved, with a thoughtful way of looking at you, as if he were really listening, not just waiting for his turn to speak. He was a carpenter by trade, a man whose hands knew the language of wood and pipe and stone. Mark always said David could fix anything, and honestly, at that point, with a bucket collecting water in the middle of my kitchen, and the faint, musty smell of damp starting to permeate everything, I was willing to believe in miracles. The doorbell rang a couple of hours later, right when the afternoon sun was slanting through the living room windows, painting stripes of light across the worn Persian rug. I smoothed down my apron. I'd been trying to salvage a batch of cookies that had decided to wage war with my oven, and took a quick glance in the hall mirror. "Eleanor, I thought you look like you've been wrestling a small badger." My hair, a mix of brown, and what I charitably called sun-kissed silver, was escaping its clip in energetic bursts, and there was a smudge of flour on my cheek. Oh well, David wasn't here for a beauty pageant. He stood on the porch, a canvas tool bag slung over one shoulder, looking much the same as I remembered, perhaps a few more lines etched around his eyes, a touch more gray at the temples. He had kind eyes, a gentle blue that seemed to hold a certain weariness, but also a quiet strength. He offered a small, almost shy smile. "Eleanor, Mark said you had a bit of a situation." "David, thank you so much for coming on such short notice," I said, stepping back to let him in. A bit of a situation is Mark's way of saying the kitchen is threatening to become an indoor swimming pool. He chuckled, a low, pleasant sound. "Well, let's see if we can't prevent that." I led him into the kitchen, the bucket now nearly half full. The rhythmic plink of water was loud in the otherwise quiet house. Mark was at a site meeting that would likely run late. David set his bag down with a soft thud and looked up at the discolored patch of ceiling. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just observed, his head tilted slightly. I found myself watching his face, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. There was a stillness about him that was calming, a stark contrast to Mark's usually flustered approach to domestic crisis. "All right," he said finally, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. "Mind if I take a look in the attic space above here? That's probably where our culprit is hiding." "Not at all," I replied. "The access panel is in the hallway closet. Just let me clear a path." As I moved some boxes of old photo albums and winter coats, I felt an odd sort of awareness. It wasn't uncomfortable, not exactly. It was more like when you're in a quiet room and you suddenly realize someone else is there with you, even if they haven't made a sound. David was professional, his manner polite, yet there was an undercurrent I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was just the relief of having someone competent take charge of the relentless trip. He followed me to the closet, and I pointed out the square panel in the ceiling. He pulled down the folding ladder with an ease that spoke of long practice. As he ascended, his worn jeans and work boots disappearing into the gloom of the attic, I had a sudden, vivid memory of Mark trying to do the same thing years ago to fetch Christmas decorations, nearly taking out a shelf of my grandmother's china in the process. I suppressed a smile. The sounds from above started. A soft scraping, the thud of something being moved, David's low murmur as he presumably talked to himself, or perhaps to the rebellious pipes. I busied myself making a fresh pot of coffee, the aroma a welcome counterpoint to the dampness in the air. I set out 2 mugs, the floral one for me, a plain blue one for him. It felt strangely domestic, this waiting, this anticipation of a problem being solved by hands other than my husband's. After what felt like an age, though it was probably only 20 minutes, his legs reappeared, followed by the rest of him, looking a little dusty but otherwise unfazed. He had a length of old copper pipe in his hand, green with corrosion, a tiny, almost invisible pinhole near one of the joints. "There's your troublemaker," he said, holding it out for me to see. "Looks like it's been weeping for a while, and finally decided to give up the ghost." He had a smudge of dirt on his cheekbone, and without thinking, I almost reached out to wipe it away. I caught myself just in time, my hand dropping awkwardly to my side. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Surprise? Or maybe I'd imagined it. "So, is it a big job?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant, my heart giving a little flutter for no reason I could pinpoint. "Not too bad," he said. "I've got a replacement section in the truck. Just need to cut out the old piece, fit the new one, and solder it up. The longest part will be letting the new joint set properly." He looked at me then, a direct gaze that seemed to go a little deeper than necessary. "Are you all right, Eleanor? You seem a bit distracted." His question caught me off guard. Mark, in similar circumstances, would have launched into a technical explanation, probably oblivious to whether I was paying attention or not. But David had noticed. He'd seen something in my face, my posture. "Oh, I'm fine," I said, forcing a brightness into my tone. "Just relieved. That drip was starting to get to me." He nodded slowly, but his eyes lingered on mine for a moment longer. Leaks have a way of doing that. The small, persistent problems are often the most wearing. It was a simple statement, just about a leaky pipe. But standing there in my kitchen, with the scent of coffee and damp and the quiet presence of this man who was almost a stranger, it felt like he was talking about something else entirely. Something I hadn't even realized was broken. And that, I suppose, is when things started to feel strange. Not in a frightening way, not at all. But in a way that made me feel like a door I hadn't even known existed was creaking slowly open. He went out to his truck to get the new pipe and his soldering kit. I poured the coffee, my hand a little unsteady. The silence in the kitchen felt different now, charged with an unspoken something. The drip from the ceiling continued its patient rhythm, but it was no longer the only thing I was listening to. I was listening to the subtle shift in the air, the unexpected turn the afternoon had taken, all because of a leaky pipe and my husband's friend. I found myself wondering about David, about the quiet weariness in his eyes. Mark rarely spoke of him in detail, just the usual good guy, known him for ages sort of thing. There were depths there, I sensed, depths that perhaps Mark, in his own straightforward way, had never plumbed, or maybe depths he simply hadn't mentioned to me. The thought was a curious one, unsettling yet intriguing. This man, who moved with such quiet competence, seemed to carry a world of experience within him, and for some reason I felt a pull to understand it, or at least acknowledge it. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling, this sudden curiosity about someone I barely knew, especially someone who was, for all intents and purposes, just here to fix a plumbing problem. The ordinariness of the task seemed at odds with the subtle undercurrents I was experiencing. I told myself it was just the stress of the leak, the relief of help arriving. but a small voice, deep inside, whispered that it might be something more. He returned, his movements economical and precise, as he began to prepare the area. He laid out his tools on an old towel I'd given him, each one clean and well cared for. There was a respect in the way he handled them, a craftsman's reverence for the instruments of his trade. I watched him for a few moments, leaning against the counter, sipping my coffee. He didn't seem to mind my presence, or if he did, he gave no indication. He worked with a focused intensity, his brow furrowed, his hands sure and steady. "Can I get you anything?" I asked, suddenly feeling a bit like a spectator at my own domestic drama. "More coffee? Something to eat? I made cookies earlier, though they're a bit crispier than intended." He glanced up, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Coffee would be great, thanks. And I don't mind crispy cookies. Sometimes they're the best kind." His easy acceptance, his lack of judgment over my less-than-perfect baking, was oddly endearing. Mark would have teased me good-naturedly, but David just accepted the offer, and the cookies as they were. I refilled his mug and placed a plate with a few of the more presentable cookies beside him. He murmured his thanks, his eyes meeting mine briefly, and again I felt that little jolt, that spark of unexpected connection. It was as if we were communicating on a level that didn't require words, a subtle acknowledgement of something shared, though what that something was, I couldn't have said. It was just a feeling, a sense of being seen, truly seen, in a way I hadn't been for a long time. It was unsettling, yes, but also in a way I was only just beginning to understand, strangely comforting. The day was definitely not unfolding as I had expected. The leak in the ceiling was a tangible problem, one that David was methodically working to resolve. But another kind of fissure, an emotional one, perhaps, seemed to be opening up within me, and its repair felt far more complex, its implications far more significant. He worked steadily for the next hour, the sounds of his labor, the rasp of a small saw cutting through the old pipe, the gentle hiss of the soldering torch, the occasional clink of metal on metal, becoming a new, more purposeful rhythm in the kitchen. I found myself staying, not wanting to retreat to another part of the house, even though there was nothing for me to do but watch. I teddied the countertops, wiped away imaginary crumbs, anything to give me a reason to linger. There was a quiet companionship in the shared space, even with minimal conversation. Occasionally, he'd ask a question. "Do you know if Mark has a heavier wrench?" Or, "Could you pass me that rag?" And I'd comply, feeling a strange sense of usefulness, of participation in the restoration of my home. The patch of ceiling around the leak was now larger, a gaping hole where he'd cut away the damaged drywall to access the pipes properly. It looked worse, in a way, than the original stain, but it felt different. This was controlled destruction, a necessary step towards healing. It made me think about other things in life, things that sometimes needed to be broken open, examined, and carefully mended, even if the process itself was messy and uncomfortable. When he finally finished soldering the new section of pipe, he straightened up, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "That should do it," he said. "We'll need to let it cure for a bit, an hour at least, before we test it under full pressure. But the main culprit is dealt with." "You make it look so easy," I said, genuinely impressed. Mark and I were ready to tear our hair out. He smiled, a proper smile this time, and it transformed his face, making him look younger, less burdened. "Years of practice," he said, "and knowing which battles to pick with old plumbing." He began to pack away his tools, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "The drywall patch will be straightforward. I can come back tomorrow to take care of that, if that works for you. Or I can leave you the materials if Mark feels like tackling it." The thought of Mark, armed with spackle and a trowel, gave me a moment's pause. Perhaps it would be best if you did it, I said, trying to keep the amusement out of my voice. To ensure a seamless finish. David's eyes twinkled as if he understood perfectly. Happy to. Seamless finishes are my specialty. There it was again, that feeling of a double meaning, of words that skimmed the surface but hinted at something deeper. The kitchen was quiet now, the drip blessedly gone. Only the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic broke the silence. We stood there, the two of us, in the aftermath of the repair, a strange sense of calm settling over the room. The strangeness I'd felt earlier hadn't dissipated. If anything, it had intensified, coiling into a quiet sense of anticipation, though for what, I wasn't entirely sure. It was just a feeling, a subtle shift in the atmosphere between us, an awareness that this was more than just a simple repair job. It was the beginning of something, though what that something was, I couldn't yet define. But the normal, predictable rhythm of my day had been disrupted, and in its place was a quiet hum of possibility, an unexpected melody. He finished packing his tools, the canvas bag now neatly organized. "Well, Eleanor," he said, turning to face me fully, "I should let you get back to your day. I'll be back around, say, 10 tomorrow morning for the drywall, if that's all right." 10 is perfect, David, I replied, trying to keep my voice even. "And thank you, truly. You're a lifesaver. Or perhaps, I thought, a revealer of hidden things." He nodded. Glad I could help. He picked up his bag, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something more. There was a hesitation, a slight pause, as if he were considering his words. But then he just gave another small smile and headed towards the door. I walked with him, an odd reluctance slowing my steps. It felt like an interruption, his leaving, even though the primary reason for his visit was concluded. At the front door, he turned. "The cookies were good, by the way," he said. "Especially the crispy ones." I laughed, a genuine, light-hearted sound that surprised even me. I'm glad someone appreciates my accidental culinary innovations. "The best things are often accidental," he said, his gaze holding mine for a beat too long. And then, with a final nod, he was gone, his truck rumbling to life and pulling away from the curb. I stood in the doorway for a few moments, watching until his truck disappeared around the corner. The silence he left behind was different from the silence before he'd arrived. It was fuller, somehow, resonating with unspoken words and unexamined feelings. I walked back to the kitchen, the absence of the drip almost jarring. The hole in the ceiling was a stark reminder of the day's events, but it was the quiet hum in my own chest that occupied my thoughts. My husband's friend had helped me fix a leak, yes, but it felt like he'd also, inadvertently, shown me a crack in the smooth facade of my own life, a place where something else, something unexpected, might just seep in. And the strangest part of it all, I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to patch it up just yet. The day had taken a turn I hadn't anticipated, and as I looked around my quiet kitchen, I realized that the strangeness was not just in the circumstances, but within me, a stirring of something I hadn't felt in a very long time. It was a feeling of being on the cusp of discovery, a sense that the ordinary script of my life had suddenly acquired a new, unwritten scene. Mark came home late that evening, tired and preoccupied with work. He glanced at the patched pipe, pronounced David a miracle worker, and then his attention drifted to his emails. He asked briefly about my day, and I just said it was quiet, that David had fixed the leak. I didn't mention the subtle undercurrents, the strange new awareness that had settled over me. How could I? What would I even say? That his friend, a man I barely knew, had made me feel something? Something undefined but powerful, something that hinted at unexplored territories within my own heart. It wasn't a betrayal of Mark, not in any tangible sense. It was more a revelation about myself, about the quiet hunger for a different kind of connection that I hadn't even known I possessed. Later that night, lying in bed, the usual sounds of the house settling around me, I replayed the afternoon's interactions. David's calm competence, his thoughtful gaze, his unexpected observations. The small, persistent problems are often the most wearing. His words echoed in my mind. Was he just talking about plumbing? Or had he, with a carpenter's precision, pinpointed something more fundamental? I thought about my life with Mark, comfortable, familiar, but perhaps lacking a certain depth of emotional intimacy, a space where the smaller, persistent anxieties of the soul could be aired and understood. We talked, of course, Mark and I, but it was usually about logistics, schedules, the practicalities of life. The deeper, more vulnerable conversations had become rare, almost non-existent, replaced by the easy companionship of habit. I hadn't realized how much I missed that until a near stranger had looked at me and seen not just a woman with a leaky ceiling, but someone who might be, in his words, a bit distracted. The strangeness wasn't about David, not really. It was about me. It was about the unexpected stirring of a part of myself I thought had long gone dormant. He had, by simply being himself, held up a mirror, and the reflection had surprised me. It wasn't that I was unhappy with Mark, or with my life. It was more that I had become accustomed. Accustomed to the rhythms, the routines, the predictable emotional landscape. David's visit, his quiet way of being, had been like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples out into an otherwise undisturbed surface. And as I drifted off to sleep, I found myself looking forward to 10 o'clock the next morning, not just for the repair of my ceiling, but for reasons I couldn't quite articulate, reasons that hummed with a quiet, perplexing, and undeniably compelling strangeness. The prospect of seeing him again brought a flutter of anticipation that was entirely unfamiliar, a feeling I hadn't associated with a simple home repair visit before. This was new territory. The next morning, I woke with a sense of alertness I hadn't felt in ages. It was as if the world looked a little brighter, the bird song outside my window a little clearer. I chose my clothes with more care than usual, opting for a soft blue sweater that I knew brought out the color of my eyes. Why? I asked myself. It's just David coming to patch a hole in the ceiling. But the rational part of my brain was having a hard time convincing the rest of me. There was an undeniable undercurrent of something. More. I made coffee, ensuring it was fresh and hot for his arrival. I even debated baking something, then laughed at myself. This was getting a little ridiculous. And yet the feeling persisted, a light, almost giddy sensation that was both unnerving and exhilarating. Punctually at 10, the doorbell rang. My heart gave a little leap. Composing myself, I opened the door. David stood there, tool bag in hand, the same calm, steady presence as the day before. "Morning, Eleanor," he said, his voice a quiet rumble that sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. "Good morning, David. Come on in. Coffee's ready." I tried to sound casual, as if my insides weren't doing a strange little dance. He stepped inside, and the house immediately felt different, charged with his presence. We went into the kitchen, the hole in the ceiling looking rather forlorn. "Should be a relatively quick job today," he said, setting down his bag. "The main thing is getting the texture to match the rest of the ceiling. That's where the artistry comes in." He winked, and I found myself smiling. There was a lightness about him today, a subtle shift from the more reserved demeanor of the previous afternoon. Or perhaps it was me who had shifted. As he began to work, mixing the joint compound, applying it with skillful strokes, I found myself drawn into conversation with him more easily than before. We talked about mundane things at first: the weather, a new book I was reading, the traffic on his way over. But gradually the conversation deepened, veering into more personal territory. He spoke a little about his own life, about his work, about the satisfaction of creating something tangible and lasting with his hands. He didn't mention a wife or family, and I didn't ask, though the curiosity was there, a gentle tug. He asked me about my interests, my life beyond being Mark's wife and a homemaker. I found myself telling him about my old passion for painting, something I hadn't pursued in years, the canvases gathering dust in the attic, much like the boxes he'd navigated around the day before. I used to love it, I confessed, a wistful note creeping into my voice. But life just got busy, I suppose. It has a way of doing that, he said, pausing in his work to look at me. His gaze was direct, empathetic. But passion doesn't just disappear, Eleanor. It just waits. Sometimes it just needs a little encouragement to come out of hiding. His words resonated deeply, striking a chord I thought had long been silent. It was as if he saw a part of me that had become invisible, even to myself. The way he said my name, too, felt different. Mark usually shortened it to Elle or Ellie. But David used my full name, Eleanor, and in his mouth. It sounded thoughtful, significant. We talked for a long time that morning, or rather, I talked, and he listened, truly listened, asking gentle questions that drew me out in ways I hadn't anticipated. He asked about my children, now grown and flown, about my dreams for the future, now that that particular chapter of active mothering was closed. These were not questions Mark typically asked. Our conversations usually revolved around the present, the immediate, the practical. David seemed interested in the inner landscape, the places where hopes and regrets resided. At one point, he was smoothing the compound on the ceiling, his arm extended, his focus intense. You know, he said, without looking down, it's a shame to let a talent like painting go unused. The world needs more beauty, especially the kind that comes from the heart. I felt a blush creep up my neck. It's been so long, I wouldn't even know where to start. You start with one stroke, he said simply, just like I start with one patch. The rest follows. His simple wisdom, delivered without pretense, was profoundly affecting. It wasn't just about painting anymore. It was about reclaiming parts of myself I'd allowed to fade. It was about the courage to begin again, in whatever small way. The strangeness I'd felt was evolving, transforming into something that felt less like unease and more like awakening. This man, my husband's friend, was, in the course of fixing a physical leak in my home, somehow pointing out the places where my own spirit had sprung the leak, where my own vitality had been slowly, almost imperceptibly, draining away. And he wasn't just pointing it out. He was, in his own quiet way, offering a method of repair. It wasn't a dramatic, life-altering revelation, but a gentle, insistent nudge towards a more authentic self. The air in the kitchen was thick with unspoken emotions, with the dawning realization that this seemingly ordinary encounter was turning into something quite extraordinary, something that was subtly reshaping my perception of myself and my world. And the most astonishing part was how natural it felt, this unfolding connection, as if it were a conversation we were always meant to have. The patch was nearly done. David stepped back to examine his handiwork, his head tilted. A little sanding once it's dry, a touch of paint, and you'll never know there was a gaping wound here, he said. He looked at me, a soft smile playing on his lips. Amazing what a little care and attention can do, isn't it? His words again seemed to carry a dual meaning, settling into that quiet space within me that was now alert and listening. The physical repair was almost complete, but I sensed that another kind of mending, a more internal one, was just beginning. The strange feeling from the day before was still present, but it was no longer a source of confusion. Instead, it felt like a quiet hum of recognition, an acknowledgement of a shared humanity, a moment of genuine connection that had caught me entirely by surprise. He cleaned his tools meticulously, each one returned to its proper place in his worn canvas bag. The silence that fell between us was comfortable now, no longer fraught with the unknown, but filled with a sense of quiet understanding. I poured him another cup of coffee and one for myself, and we sat at the small kitchen table, the newly patched ceiling above us a testament to his skill. "Mark is lucky to have a friend like you," I said, breaking the silence. "Not just because you can fix anything, but, well, you're a good listener." David looked down at his mug, a faint flush rising on his cheeks. "Mark's been a good friend to me, too, over the years. Pulled me through some rough patches." He paused, then looked up, his blue eyes meeting mine. "We all need someone who really listens, Eleanor. Sometimes the biggest leaks aren't the ones in the plumbing." There it was again. That ability he had to see beneath the surface, to speak to the unspoken. I felt a profound sense of gratitude towards him, not just for fixing the leak, but for the unexpected gift of his presence, his perception. It was as if he had opened a window in a stuffy room, letting in fresh air and light, allowing me to see things more clearly. "You're right," I said softly. "They're not." We sat in comfortable silence for a few more minutes, the shared coffee, the quiet kitchen, the morning sun streaming through the window, creating a small, perfect moment of peace. It was a simple moment, yet it felt significant, laden with an emotional weight that was both grounding and elevating. The strangeness had resolved itself into a clear, deep sense of connection, a platonic intimacy that was more profound than many I had experienced. It was a connection forged in shared vulnerability and mutual respect, a quiet acknowledgement of the complexities of being human. When it was time for him to leave, there was no awkwardness, no lingering sense of unfinished business. He stood up, and I walked him to the door. "Thank you again, David," I said, my voice sincere. "For everything." He smiled, a genuine, open smile that reached his eyes. "Anytime, Eleanor. And don't let those paintbrushes gather any more dust, okay?" "I won't," I promised, and I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that I meant it. He gave a small nod, then turned and walked to his truck. I watched him go, just as I had the day before, but this time the feeling was different. It wasn't confusion or unease. It was a sense of quiet gratitude, of unexpected grace. My husband's friend had helped me fix a leak, and in doing so, he had helped me find a part of myself I thought I had lost. Things had gotten strange, yes, but the strangeness had led to a moment of profound clarity, a personal discovery that felt like a new beginning. The house was quieter without the drip, but my inner world felt richer, more vibrant, filled with the gentle echo of a meaningful conversation and the promise of rediscovery. It was, in its own unexpected way, exactly what I hadn't known I needed. The "you won't believe what happened" wasn't some scandalous affair, but a quiet revolution of the spirit, a reminder that connection and growth can appear in the most unexpected of guises, even in the middle of a mundane Tuesday, with a man who came to fix a leaky pipe. In the days that followed, the quiet hum of that connection with David lingered. It wasn't a constant preoccupation, but rather a subtle background note, a reminder of the depth of feeling that had been stirred. Mark, busy with his latest project, a challenging new commercial building downtown, noticed little beyond the expertly patched ceiling. He praised David's work again, marveling at how seamlessly the new paint blended with the old. "You can't even tell there was ever a problem," he'd said, and I'd smiled, thinking that some problems, once addressed, truly could disappear, while others simply transformed into something new. I found myself drawn to the attic a few days later. The access panel, which David had so easily navigated, seemed to beckon. With a determined breath, I pulled down the folding ladder, the metallic screech echoing slightly in the hallway. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from the bare bulb as I ascended into the cavernous space. There they were in the far corner under a draped sheet, my old easel, a wooden box of dried-out oil paints, and a stack of canvases, their surfaces blank and waiting. A wave of emotions washed over me. Nostalgia, a touch of regret for the lost years, but also a surprising surge of excitement. David's words echoed in my mind. Passion doesn't just disappear, Eleanor. It just waits. I ran a hand over the smooth, cool wood of the easel. It felt like greeting an old friend. I remembered the hours I used to spend lost in color and form, the sheer joy of creation. Why had I stopped? Life, yes. Children, Mark's career, the relentless demands of running a household. But if I were truly honest with myself, I had also allowed a certain fear to creep in. The fear of not being good enough, the fear of failure, the fear of exposing too much of my inner self on canvas. David, with his quiet encouragement, had somehow disarmed those fears, or at least diminished their power. You start with one stroke. I brought the easel down, along with the box of paints and a small, unused canvas. The paints were mostly beyond salvaging, hardened into intractable lumps of pigment. But the act of trying, of intending to create, felt significant. I made a mental note to visit the art supply store, a place I hadn't set foot in for over a decade. The thought alone sent a little thrill through me. That evening, I found myself looking at Mark with new eyes. Our comfortable silences, which I had perhaps begun to interpret as a lack of connection, now felt different. Not necessarily deeper, not yet, but holding a potential I hadn't acknowledged. Maybe the responsibility for emotional intimacy wasn't solely his. Maybe I had also retreated into the familiar, the safe, the unspoken. David's visit had shown me the power of reaching out, of asking the questions that mattered, of truly listening to the answers. Mark, I said, as we were clearing the dinner dishes, a routine so ingrained we could do it in our sleep. Do you remember that little gallery in Vermont we visited on our honeymoon? The one with all the landscape paintings. He paused, a plate halfway to the dishwasher, a surprised look on his face. Vermont? Wow, Elle, that was a lifetime ago. Vaguely. Why? I was just thinking about it today, I said, drying a glass with more attention than it probably needed. I was thinking I might try painting again. He turned to me, really looked at me, a slow smile spreading across his face. Painting? That's unexpected. But good. I always loved your paintings. You were good, you know. His simple affirmation, so readily given, warmed me. Maybe the channels of communication weren't as blocked as I'd imagined. Maybe they just needed a new topic, a new approach. Well, I'm probably terribly rusty, I said, a little shyly. But I thought I might give it a try. I think that's great, he said, and he reached out and squeezed my arm. A small gesture, but it felt genuine, supportive. Perhaps David's visit hadn't just opened a door within me, but had also subtly shifted the dynamics within my marriage, creating a tiny opening for new conversations, new understandings. Life didn't transform overnight. There were no dramatic declarations or sudden epiphanies. But there was a shift, a gentle, persistent movement towards something more. I bought new paints, fresh canvases. I set up my easel in the spare bedroom, the one with the good morning light. My first few attempts were clumsy, hesitant. The colors felt alien in my hands, the brushes stiff and unfamiliar. But I persevered, remembering David's words, You start with one stroke. And slowly, tentatively, something began to emerge. Not masterpieces by any means, but expressions. Expressions of feeling, of memory, of the quiet beauty I was starting to notice again in the world around me. I didn't see David again for several months. Life settled back into its usual rhythms, but with that new underlying note of awareness. Then, one Saturday, Mark mentioned he was going to help David with a small construction project at his own place. David was adding a new deck. "Want to ride along?" Mark asked casually. You could see what the miracle worker's own place looks like. A little flutter of something. Anticipation? Nervousness. Went through me. "Sure," I said, trying to sound as casual as Mark. "Why not?" David lived in a small, charmingly rustic house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees. It had a workshop attached, the scent of sawdust and varnish hanging in the air. He greeted us with his usual quiet warmth, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled. He looked well, perhaps a little more relaxed than when I'd last seen him. While Mark and David discussed plans and measurements, I wandered into his workshop. It was a craftsman's haven, tools neatly arranged, works in progress covered with cloths, sketches pinned to a large corkboard. And there, on one of the walls, were several small, beautifully carved wooden birds, so lifelike they seemed ready to take flight. "These are incredible, David," I said when he came in to find a specific tool. He smiled, a touch of pride in his eyes. "Just a hobby. Something to keep the hands busy and the mind quiet." He picked one up, a delicate wren, and turned it over in his calloused fingers. There's a satisfaction in bringing something beautiful out of a simple piece of wood. We talked for a while, not about leaks or plumbing, but about creativity, about the quiet joy of making things. I told him I'd started painting again. His face lit up. "That's wonderful, Eleanor. I knew you would." There was no awkwardness, no lingering strangeness. Just a comfortable, respectful friendship that had grown out of an unexpected encounter. He was Mark's friend, yes, but in a quiet way, he had become my friend too. A friend who had, without intending to, helped me to see myself more clearly, to reconnect with a part of myself I had neglected. As we drove home later that day, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows, I felt a sense of peace, of quiet contentment. The experience with David hadn't been a dramatic, life-altering event in the way that sensational stories often portray. It had been something much quieter, much more profound. It was about the subtle power of human connection, the way one person can inadvertently open a door for another, leading to personal discovery and growth. It was about mutual respect, about being seen and heard, about the unexpected ways in which life can surprise you, even in its most ordinary moments. My husband's friend had helped me fix a leak, and in the process, things had indeed gotten strange. Strange in the sense that they had veered off the predictable path, leading me to a place of new understanding and quiet joy. And what happened? I had rediscovered a lost passion, found a new depth in my own emotional landscape, and learned that sometimes the most meaningful connections are the ones you least expect, arriving quietly, like a skilled craftsman, to mend more than just a broken pipe. They mend the small, persistent leaks in the soul, allowing the spirit to fill once more with light and possibility. And that, I think, is a story worth telling.